Hello, this is Christina Wallis, and I just have to confess that I've managed to totally fall in love with this beautiful, unassuming, no try-hard flower. If it's your first time on my channel, I upload tutorials on handmade flowers, mostly out of cold porcelain and occasionally out of sugar. And I manage to do that almost every week. So if it sounds like your cup of tea, do please subscribe and do please join our little community here. So the way I cut out each petal is I try to keep the middle a little bit thicker because I am planning to wire all the petals, and obviously it goes thinner as you spread it outwards. These petals are very simple, so you could freehand them. I, however, prefer to make little cutouts, cardboard cutouts, just like so, simply because I find that I have more control over them, over the thickness and so on, when it comes to larger shapes. If you've been watching my other videos, you would probably know that sometimes this next step, which is thinning of edges, I do on the palm of my hand. However, when it comes to bigger and thicker shapes, I find that this is more reliable a way of doing it. Now that liquid was water, and now we're going to wire your petals, and actually you could just lick it. Seeing that it's non-edible medium of cold porcelain we're working with, it's going to cause offense to absolutely no one. So as you could see, I'm bending it here because I am going to put this cutout in a very curved Veiners, just this one, and so I don't want the wire poking through cold porcelain, and sometimes it does. Now this is very important, the aligning stage. This Veiners is very pronounced, and you'll see why I'm using such a pronounced Veiners later, but also that means that you need to be particularly careful with aligning all the parallels so that they don't go across your petal instead of along how they're supposed to, all the veins and things. When you're working with a larger Veiners, make sure that you apply very even pressure across it. With rose petals, it's not quite as important as with some others, but it's a good habit to get into. Now here I'd forgotten to add either dust or petal base to the Veiners, so I'm trying to disattach it so it doesn't tear or goes out of shape. Now my camera wasn't picking up the veins very well, but you do need to have a good Veiners for this particular flower if you're planning to do it the way I have and use paints to kind of relay the texture, or else you might want to paint the veins and so on over the petals if you don't have a very pronounced Veiners. So I've chosen to go with a very detailed and elaborate middle for this hellebore. Hellebores come in all different shapes of middles as well as petals, so really it's free for all what combo you choose, but I've decided to go with a queen middle and subtler petals, just for a change really, because there's loads of stuff otherwise going on online and stuff. So back to the middle, it's not actually very complicated. You can cover it with water or glue and then start inserting the little seeds. just to your liking, really, to any each way, as long as you like it. I find that adding glue actually helps because they don't fall out then, and obviously I will be keeping all these flowers for a long time. So yeah, glue is a good idea. And this is the shape that I personally really like. I've tried different shapes and that's the one I settled on. And now we're going to make all the strands that go on the sides of our middle. And obviously the idea here would be to try and make it look as if those strands were running throughout the whole middle. So here I'm adding a little bit of water and just gluing bunches of 4, 5 or even 6, more or less the same kind of lengths. You could use just thread, but I found that because these stamens are already hardened and easy to manipulate into a shape, I decided to use them instead, especially that I don't seem to be using all that many stamens and they kind of just sit around there. So this is the ideal shape. You could choose down to your own liking whether you like all these strands to go very symmetrical. I wasn't too bothered about 100% symmetricity. It's quite a sticky tricky process. So yeah, depends how much time you have, depends how incredibly tidy you are with your flowers, which I'm not, so I'll cut corners here. And yeah, so when you put your main strands, then you just use half strands to fill out the gaps, and then you cut all the excess from the bottom with sharp scissors. Sorry, I've seem to have deleted the bit where I cut it. So now it's the time to put final touches to your little stamen tops, and so just make sure you glue enough of them to hide all the ends of your thread and have a nice finishing line. And yeah, the next step is adding color. Clearly my dusts didn't work at all on a thread, so I am going to go with my favorite medium as of late, paint. Oil paint. So initially I was just going to go with magenta, but then it looked a little bit on a fake side, a little bit too jolly and unnatural. So I've added a violet color, and that pretty much is the two colors that I'm using throughout this flower. And I always try to keep colors simple if I could possibly help it. It's easy to remember and generally less chance of getting your color too dirty. And as usual with colorings, especially with adding deeper colors, try to do it in layers from lighter to darker. Because I've been working with colors for a little while now, I tend to go bolder. I have a feel for it, not a natural feel. I gained a feel for it. But if you're just starting out, try to go very easy on your colors and then layer by layer add deeper colors. With oil paints it's particularly important as they're harder to remove, especially hard to remove from a thread, perhaps easier from the actual cold porcelain when it's dry. So here with my green I went all the way up to the base of where the little seeds begin, and actually on the inside it doesn't seem as to be such a great idea. I would leave a little bit of a white space to just kind of add three-dimensional feel to it. Basically it didn't work. Yeah, that idea didn't work, but for the future now I would know, and it would become a little attribute to my flower skills. And here I'm using white paint semi-dry brush just to add a little bit of a highlight to the seedy top of my flower middle, and pretty much you could use this technique to add highlights to many different flowers and many different textures. So once the highlight is in place, we're going to compare the middle to the petals just to see that the sizing is all good and it looks fine. And also, as you can see, the petals are of slightly cool green shade and the middle is a very warm shade. So the reason for that is that I had some really warm yellow shade of green to use up and I didn't want it to go waste. So we're going to try to make it marry up together, because cool shades and warm shades don't always go well together, but if we kind of add some highlights using paint, that might work quite nicely. And so this is I'm just using little stamens, any little stamens you could find. These particular ones are the ones I purchased from the old bakery, so they are Japanese, nice quality stamens, and I'm just shaping them to give them slightly more natural shape. And this is a very thick glue which would hopefully help me to stick those little individual stamens much easier and quicker. It's quite fiddly and tricky actually. Well, not that tricky, but certainly fiddly. For those of you who really like to follow botanical correctness to a T, I just want to point out that this is, I'm kind of taking a bit of artistic license to it, and the outer stamens, for all I know, they're not any bigger than the stamens inside. I mean, I'm sure somewhere in nature it might be possible, but here I just like the look of it. I like the kind of the contrast of slightly bigger and smaller stamens. And we're going to make the very characteristic for winter rose little, what shall I call them? They're like elephant trunks, aren't they? And this little tool, it's a very good tool to use with cold porcelain stuff. It's not available in UK. You could get hold of one of them from Etsy. I also provide them for my students readily for sale, but yeah, you could just try and use toothpick or find something in your household that would do the job perfectly. And so the smaller the endings of these tools are, the smaller your little elephant trunks gonna be. But for my flower, I want to keep them quite large and quite disorderly. I don't want them looking too neat. I mean, they could be a little bit neater than mine, but I don't want them to look neat. I want them to look quite disorderly and quite unintentional. So if you want them neater, make sure that your clay is very, very fresh and you work reasonably fast, and also thin all the inside very, very carefully. Basically take a longer time with each of these little shapes, and you're going to be good to go. So just a quick note, that little pot in the background is petal based, and I was dipping my metal stick in it to stop it from sticking, and someone told them that petal base, it's not a good cream or base to use with cold porcelain. I have never heard of that, and I love using it, at least until it goes old and crumbly. But if you know why you can't use it with cold porcelain, please let me know. I would be very interested to know. Now here we have a second layer. As you could see, in between layers I wrapped my little center in plastic because it's easier to attach these parts together if they're not over dried. And now we're going to start on petals. Yay! Petals, 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 the easiest bit of this flower. Finally, petals are never the easiest bit of a flower I find, or at least hardly ever. But this one is middle heavy blessed flower. What other middle heavy flowers do you know? There's arguably peony sometimes, and also what else? Peony, I just can't think. peony, and also that weird one with millions of petals. What is it? I really can't think. I have a brain freeze. Anyway, so here I'm using the same two paints. Good idea to use the same paints throughout to really have some continuity. And yes, I'm going to thread very carefully, and I'm going to have my middle very subtle and very light. Sorry about the focus here. Very dry brush, very dry brush. So yeah, I'm going to keep my middle very subtle because the very center of my winter rose is very flamboyant, very detailed, and very kind of bright and detailed. I don't want it to fight for attention with inside petals, so I'm going to keep inside petals very plain and very subtle and very light, and I'm going to do outside petals a little bit louder. So yeah, I did play with the idea of really going to town with all the veins and what have you inside as well, but I've decided to not do that because that would be counterproductive. And so yeah, outside again, if you want to use this technique, make sure you use good Veinner, very pronounced Veinner, and keep your brush very flat. Some of you may have used this technique with dusts, and the good news is that this is much easier. This technique is much easier with paints than it is with dust, because paints don't get into all the crevices quite as easily, and also they tend to be a lot brighter than dust from the word go. So really all the petals, as you would be able to see in a minute, all my petals are not identical, and I love it that way. I wouldn't want them to be identical. And yeah, basically have some spares, but it does look harder than it actually is. So this is what we do. And with this one we use semi-dry brush, not fully dry brush. Don't try it with not fully dry brush. Yeah, exactly. Don't try to use dry brush because I don't think it's going to work as well, and it's going to be less crisp a result. And with something like this, you would need to have that spray that dries your petals. Use about 3 or 4 layers of spray intermittently until you find that your fingers don't have any paint residue on them anymore. And here we go. That's your backs of your petals. So before I start on the pigmentation of my inside petals, I'm going to add this little bit of a warm shade paint to the inside to really just tie in the middle and the cooler outside, or rather outer petals. Here you go. And this is acrylic paint, and acrylic paint is brilliant for little dots because it dries really quickly, it stays put, and it's really sharp, lovely, and durable over time. And here I'm using toothpick to add this pigment on the inside of the petal. And I picked up this tip from my student. I was using a very expensive, very thin brush that wasn't giving me as good a result as this does, because it was kind of dragging and occasionally leaving non-crisp dots. So toothpick works beautifully for this. Never seen anyone use toothpicks before my student suggested it, and what a lovely tip. I learned a lot from my students, that much is true. So as you can see, I have that other petal that's already done, for really just to try. The idea was to have them all the same, but me being me, I've kind of got sidetracked halfway through and found a pattern that I preferred. So as a end result, they're not the same. These two are more or less the same, but then I have a random one. I mean, on outside I don't want them to be the same, but on an inside I wanted to follow the same pattern. But then I got seduced by this more casual pattern on your right. And yeah, now I'm going to show you this ball sack looking thing. I'm just going to throw it away. I was trying to learn how to make poppy pots, but yeah, no, never got there. I got bored. So yeah, I'm just going to show you very quickly how to make that base for the middle. Sorry to stick it in the middle of the video. I'm going to do that now and again to make sure that you guys watch it all. I don't think I could explain how to do it, so just leave it to watch it, and I am going to link up another video on how to do these, more detailed one, separate video in the description. This green board should give you a size reference. Each of the squares is 1 centimeter, and this is to just give you an idea of variation of my outside and inside petal pigmentation. Now I'm going to assemble this flower, and the first step here for me is to use floral tape. Now you have to stretch it to activate the glue. And then this could be quite tricky, covering each wire with the tape. You need to try to do it neatly. It adds to the thickness of the flower stem. So with something like, I don't know, ranunculus, peony, what have you, it's gonna add way too much thickness. For peony, ranunculus you generally don't wire, but with peony or something, multi-petals. But since we don't have multi-petals here, it's actually a good idea, in my opinion, to use a little bit of tape, because it makes this process of taping everything together a lot easier. Following my principle to use the thinnest wire I could get away with, I have used wire number 26 for this chunky petals, and as it goes, it wasn't quite thick enough, so it made it a lot harder to assemble since they're a little bit floppy. Number 24 would have been ideal, maybe slightly harder to insert, but ideal for this purpose. So although I've added a sticky, I've covered each little wire with flower tape, making it less sticky and easier to position around the center, my petals are still quite hard to work with, which is why it probably shows, or maybe it doesn't, but yes, for this 24 is a good one. And I am not going to show you how to cover the stem with cold porcelain to make it beautiful and sleek, the way cold porcelain medium allows you to have it with flowers. I will link up a rose stem that I've covered in the detail is a dedicated video, or loads of my videos have info on how to cover the stems. And this is it. I am going to probably add a stem and a little calyx here. I'm not bothered about showing you those. You could just copy them by yourself. And yeah, thank you for popping in to my channel. I seem to be totally addicted to it, so I'll see you next week, hopefully. Bye bye for now.